The senator from Tennessee?
We are not in a quorum call, are we?
No, we're not, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to concur with my colleague from Tennessee in his beautifully stated remarks and the way he has brought forward the frustration that Tennesseans have. You know, Mr. President, I had the opportunity to be at home yesterday. We have a great event going on in Nashville this weekend. It is called the Grand Prix. And I had the opportunity to be at the opening event with a lot of women, small business owners. I had the opportunity later in the day to go cut the ribbon for a big county fair and see lots of families and talk to families that were there. And you know what, Mr. President? They are completely confused with what is going on. See, Tennesseans are really smart. They watch what is happening in Washington, D.C., and they are so concerned about the future and about freedom and freedom's cause. And they continue to say, as my colleague from Tennessee stated, they want the best for their children, for their grandchildren, because they appreciate the American dream. Many of them have lived the American dream, whether they're a farmer or a teacher, whether they're a lawyer, an accountant, a mom, a dad, somebody who owns a small business on Main Street in one of our 95 counties in our beautiful towns. They've lived it. They're living it every single day. Blood, sweat, tears, working long hours, investing. And they look at what is happening here in Washington, and they are saying, why are you in such a rush to force us into bankruptcy? You know, July 6, 2010, I use this statement all the time, Mr. President. Someone that you and I each know because of our work on armed services, Admiral Mullen. July 6, 2010, he was asked a question: what keeps you up at night? What is the greatest threat to our nation's freedom, our democracy? You know what he said? He said, our nation's debt. Now let me walk you back through the history of that debt. If we were to go from the time that George Washington became president up until the time that George W. Bush stepped out of office, our nation had accrued a total of $10.6 trillion in debt. Too much for me. I used to, when I would go to the White House with President Bush, I would say, Mr. President, there's two things that I think need to be addressed. Number one is the out-of-control federal spending, and number two is the issue of illegal immigration. Well, he left office $10.6 trillion in debt, but still very mild compared to what we're facing today, I think we would have to say. Now, President Obama took office, and he and Joe Biden went to work, and you know what they did in 8 years? Mr. President, they ended up just about doubling our nation's debt. Doubled it. President Trump came in, tried to pare back on regulations, cut the size of the federal government, and then we had COVID, that added to the debt, and then here comes President Biden. And it is as if the printing presses have cranked up on printing those dollar bills, running them through as fast as they possibly can. Because What the Biden administration and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have pushed through was $1.9 trillion, saying that was necessary for CARES, even though all that money that had previously been spent had been appropriated, had not been spent. And now, here we have $1.2 trillion, and as my colleague said, it's become this bill of, here's a little bit for infrastructure, but oh, by the way, over here, here's this great big down payment on the Green New Deal. Don't worry that we don't generate enough electricity for an electric vehicle fleet. We'll figure that one out later. Let's just put in subsidies for electric vehicles. Don't worry about giving more power to the federal government. We'll give you back authority, local governments, if we think you need it. $1.2 trillion in spending. And then we hear that the bonus round in this Lollapalooza, it's going to be $3.5 trillion. But more likely, the realistic view is it's going to be $5 trillion. So back to my point, Mr. President, people in Tennessee are saying, what in the world could you possibly be thinking? What could you possibly be thinking? Because they know the history of this nation's debt. And you know what, Mr. President, and this really relates to much of the work that we do at SASC. They know that there is a threat from the people that own or hold our debt. Japan, our friend and ally, they're at the top of the tier right now. Last time I checked last month on who owns our debt, you know, number 2 is China. They own well over $1 trillion or hold over $1 trillion of our debt. And if you put the OPEC nations together, and of course, after the Keystone Pipeline, we're now dependent on OPEC and others for fuel. We were energy independent thanks to President Trump and Republicans in the House and Senate. We were energy independent. But OPEC is there in that top 5, all those OPEC countries grouped together. So people in Tennessee are really quite, they're miffed. They're put off by what is going on. I was really surprised. I had a text this morning from one of my county mayors. I'm all for infrastructure, I'm for the Cornyn Amendment, but you know what, I'm not for this bill. Because you've got less or about 25% of this that goes for something that we would deem infrastructure. Tennesseans love to talk about infrastructure as 4 things. And they talk about roads, rivers, railways, and runways. And of course, we're a logistics state. Everyone knows Memphis has a big port and a rail hub, one of 2 cities where all 5 Class A railroads come into that city. They know that interstates are important. They crisscross our state, indeed Nashville, where you have 3 major interstates that crisscross right there in the middle of that city. They know that Tennessee, so many businesses choose to locate there because we're within an 8-hour drive of a majority of the nation's population. So logistics require good roads and rivers and rail and runways. But you know what? They're not seeing it in this. When you, in the name of infrastructure, spend this amount of money. Now, I have great respect for my colleagues on each side of the aisle that have worked to produce a product, to do it in a bipartisan way. That is commendable. It's commendable. For Tennesseans, the result is something that is frustrating to them. You know, this is considered to be the world's greatest deliberative body. I always appreciated how our former colleague, Senator Alexander, would talk about the cup and saucer. The hot coffee gets poured into the cup, it spills over into the saucer, it cools off, you add some sweetener, and you get something that you enjoy. People expect more. They expect better of this deliberative body. And Tennesseans know that our nation's freedom has been well served by robust, respectful, bipartisan debate. That's a good thing. It strengthens freedom. It brings people together. It brings them to the table to talk about what is their priority. Now, unfortunately, most of us in this body have not had the opportunity to be at that table. And amendments that we have worked on that we felt like would have improved this bill are not going to be heard. Not here, not in a hearing, in a committee. We're just not going to see that as a part of this process. That is unfortunate. And it is going to be unfortunate if, indeed, that happens on the next bill, or the bill after that, or the bill after that. We should return to regular order and go through this process. Now, I had about 30 amendments that I had offered as improvements for this bill, and Mr. President, rest assured, I'm not going to stand here and go through each and every one of those amendments. But there are some things I thought needed our attention in this bill. As many of my colleagues know, broadband is something that, whether I was serving in the House or back in the state Senate in Tennessee, or before that, going in and reorganizing a Tennessee Film, Entertainment, and Music Commission for our governor, broadband and moving from analog to digital, making high-speed internet available all across our state, closing that digital divide. I've spent so many hours working on this, and I filed 3 amendments that I felt like would really do some damage control on these and help close the divide, getting to our rural and unserved areas, people that have no internet. Amendment 2327 would have prohibited the federal government from forcing municipal broadband provider programs into states that have outlawed them. Now, Tennessee is one of those states that says to municipalities, if you want to serve people within your city, that's great, you go ahead. But you can't go outside of your boundaries. And there are other states that have had this issue. And there's a reason they say, if you serve your constituents, great, but don't go outside that. It's because states that have allowed these schemes ended up banning them for a reason. And usually it's because these government-run systems would end up imploding, leaving the taxpayers with the bill that they were going to have to pay. Now, another amendment, Amendment 2377, would have prohibited the FCC, our Federal Communications Commission, from implementing price-setting schemes on broadband providers. That, allowing the FCC to do that rate setting and price setting, would destroy investment in rural broadband. It would destroy it. We know this. And it would actually incentivize providers in avoiding these unserved areas. Sometimes we talk about that as being that last mile that needs to get that fiber, that last mile that needs fixed wireless, that last mile that is needing some form of connectivity. And Amendment 2328, and we do hope this one makes it in the bill, would strike language permitting regulators to allow these broadband grant recipients to use the money for, and I'm quoting the language in the bill, any use determined necessary to facilitate the goals of the program, end quote. Now, Mr. President, this sounds vague. It is vague. And if there's one thing that we learned prior, when we put a lot of money out during President Obama's time, is that sometimes this money ends up not being targeted to broadband, but ends up as a slush fund. We also have an amendment that would deal with a shovel-ready infrastructure project on our southern border. Amendment 2406 would redirect $1 billion from Amtrak. By the way, Amtrak's getting many billions of dollars in this bill. And it would send that money over to the Department of Homeland Security to finish the southern border wall construction. We all know what is happening on that border. Record numbers of illegal aliens coming in, many very sick, COVID positive. We know that they are ending up, as are drugs, as are gangs, in cities and towns across this nation. Indeed, until we secure this southern border, every town is a border town, every state is a border state. And God bless our law enforcement officers who are fighting this every day. I'm hearing from them, and I want them to know I hear them, and I understand the pressures that they are under. And we also know that our communities are struggling, trying to get back to work and really move forward with regrowing the economy. But inflation has gotten in the way. And one of the big problems is that people point to with the high cost of fuel and logistics and of packing materials is the killing of the Keystone Pipeline. So Amendment 2298 would amend Section 4034 of the bill, which calls for a study on job loss and impacts on consumer energy due to the revocation of the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. My amendment says that if the report shows that killing the pipeline caused numerous job losses and an impact on consumer energy cost, that the president should revoke, he shall revoke his executive order and get out of the way of the pipeline construction. Get people back to work and get the prices at the pump, get them down. Get them down to where they were when President Trump left office. I mean, what's the purpose of a report if it doesn't have any teeth? So let's take an action on that. You know, Mr. President, there is no bill that is ever perfect. They all have to be worked on. Many times we come back a year or so later and we do technical corrections on a bill. We make changes. And this is no different. This bill needs time. It needs a thorough amendment process. It needs to go back to the committees of jurisdiction to work through these issues. Are the American people for infrastructure? Yes, they are for infrastructure. Tennesseans are for infrastructure. I'm for infrastructure projects. Yes, indeed. Am I for this piece of legislation? No, because it's a document that has misplaced priorities. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will close.